She carried wounded wolves home for years. Not one had been the Alpha King's wolf, until tonight. I had fought in every Borderland campaign Draveth had ever mounted, and I had learned to read the battlefield the way a sailor reads water, by its surface tension, by the particular silence that meant the iron traps had been sprung, by the quality of blood on the frost. I had lost men. I had lost wolves. I had learned to absorb loss the way stone absorbs cold, deep and without complaint, until the cold became simply the texture of everything. What I had never lost was Care. He was old, older than most bond wolves had any right to be, silver from muzzle to tail where he had once been pale gold. And the bond between us had been forged when I was 17, and he had walked out of the Ashfin wood on his own and pressed his broad head against my knee as if he had been waiting for me specifically, and simply needed me to stop moving long enough to be found. That was how the bond wolves worked in the old stories, and I had dismissed the old stories until Care made a liar of me. The bond between a king and his wolf was not the leash my council imagined it to be. It was closer to a second heartbeat, present always, audible only when you went still enough to listen. When Care's heartbeat went quiet on the third night of the Ashfin Crossing campaign, I was in the command tent with my war council, and I stood up from the campaign table mid-sentence and walked out of the tent without explanation, and not one of my generals was foolish enough to follow me. "Sire," that was Brennan, my first marshal, at the tent flap. "The trap reports suggest the northwest corridor." "Stay with the line," I said, and I walked into the dark. The borderland between Draveth's northern edge and the unclaimed territory beyond the Ashfin Crossing was a misery of frozen ground and sprung iron, traps laid by the rival packs to slow our patrols, our own traps laid to slow theirs, and in the middle of all of it, a narrow corridor of contested ground that belonged, in practice, to no one. Wolves went in there and did not always come out. Men went in there and rarely came out at all. My council had been trying to get me to cede the Ashfin corridor for 2 campaigns, arguing it cost more to hold than it was worth. I had never ceded it, and I could not have told you precisely why until that night, walking northwest alone through iron-cold air with one hand on the knife at my belt, and the other reaching out into the silence where Care's heartbeat should have been. There was something in the corridor, something that had been in it for a long time. Not a threat, not a rival patrol, something warm and consistent, like a hearth lit in the same place every night, the kind of constancy that rewrites the landscape around it so gradually that you stop seeing the landscape and only see the light. I found Care's blood first. A drag trail through frozen moss, deeper on the left side. He had been dragging his left foreleg. An iron trap, then, or the edge of one, a graze or a spring catch that had not held but had torn. The trail was perhaps 4 hours old by the temperature of what remained on the frozen ground. He had kept moving. Bondwolves always kept moving towards something. That was their nature, the old loyalty that ran deeper than instinct, and Care had kept moving northwest, away from the battle line and away from me, which meant he had been moving towards something with more pull than the bond itself. I did not know what that meant then. I understand it perfectly now. The trail led through a cut in the hill and down a long slope of frozen heather, and at the bottom of the slope, set back against a rise of black rock with its single window amber with firelight, was a cottage. Not a pack outpost. No marks, no ward flags, no patrol signs. Just a stone cottage with a light on and a thin thread of peat smoke rising from a chimney, and the drag trail of my bond wolf leading directly to the door. I stood at the edge of the heather slope for a moment that felt longer than it was, my hand on my knife, the night absolutely still around me. The borderland was never still. The borderland had a sound, wind, and iron, and the distant percussion of patrol movements. The borderland did not go quiet like this, full and close and attended, as if the air itself was waiting for something. My wrist burned. Not the burn of cold or the burn of an old campaign wound. This was specific and deliberate, a line of heat around my left wrist under the cuff of my riding glove, like a brand laid there by someone who knew exactly what they were marking and why. I had read about the mate mark in the old records. My Chamberlain had described it to me once carefully, the way he described most things he believed I would dismiss. A warmth, he had said, a recognition that arrives before the mind does. I pulled off my glove and looked at my wrist in the dark. Nothing visible yet, but the warmth was there, specific and insistent, and it was pulling me toward the light in the window. I walked down the slope. The door was solid old wood, iron-hinged, no nameplate. A pair of boots on the step, small and worn at the toe. A bundle of dried plants hung above the lintel, not wards, not pack marks, just herbs, the kind used in field dressings. I had seen those bundles at every healer's threshold I had ever crossed. I knocked. There was a pause, not the pause of fear, not the scramble and hush of someone hiding, but simply the pause of a person who was in the middle of something and was setting it down properly before coming to the door. Then footsteps, unhurried. Then the latch lifted. She opened the door and looked at me. She was perhaps 30, perhaps younger. It was difficult to read ages in borderland faces, weathered and clear-eyed the way all the northern people were. She had dark hair pinned back without ceremony, a healer's apron over plain clothes, and her hands were the first thing I noticed, and the thing I cannot stop noticing even now. All these years later, her hands were worn. Calloused at the palms, scarred at the right thumb from what had been a deep instrument cut, faintly stained at the knuckles in the way that said she had been working with wound wash recently. A healer's hands, working hands, honest hands. She looked at me without alarm, without performance. She looked at me the way someone looks at a neighbor's visitor, present, mildly curious, not yet certain what was needed. "Your wolf is inside," she said. "He's going to be all right." And the mate mark on my wrist went from warm to incandescent. I felt it before she did, or perhaps she felt it first and simply did not show it, the way she did most things, inwardly and without theater. She looked down at my wrist and then at her own, and on her left wrist, through the sleeve she had pushed up past the elbow to work, the same line of gold-lit heat was tracing itself against her skin, visible now, a mark that had been waiting there in potential all her life and was only now choosing to be seen. She was very still. "Come in," she said, and stepped back. I have thought about that moment many times since. Most people, upon having a mate mark appear on their wrist at the same moment as a stranger who had appeared out of the borderland dark, wearing a campaign rider's coat and a king's insignia, would have reacted. Would have stepped back, or caught their breath audibly, or said something artless and true. Marin stepped back and held the door open and said, "Come in," with the exact same composure with which she might have welcomed a wolf she had found in the heather. I would later learn that this was simply how she was. Care was on the hearthstone, which he had apparently claimed without negotiation, his silver bulk taking up the best position near the fire with the authority of an old animal who knows exactly what he is owed. His left foreleg was wrapped neatly, better than most of my campaign surgeons would have managed, in clean linen, and a splint fashioned from 2 pieces of smooth wood. He had a shallow bowl of water beside him, and what appeared to be the remnants of a very generous portion of roasted meat. He looked, in short, like a wolf who had arrived somewhere and decided to stay. When I came through the door, Care opened one eye, assessed me with the unhurried certainty of a bond wolf who has never once in his long life been uncertain about anything, and closed it again. "How bad is the foreleg?" I asked. "The trap caught the outer edge," she said, moving back to the hearthside stool she had clearly been sitting on when I knocked, picking up the work she had set down, wound drap, scissors, a small jar of something that smelled of pine and copperroot. "It didn't spring fully. The tendon isn't cut, just strained badly, and there's a gash along the outer shin I've closed with 3 stitches. He'll want to rest it for 2 weeks. After that, I'd say he'll be fully himself." She considered. "He gave me some argument about the splint." "He always does." She looked up at me. There was something in her expression, not quite a smile, not one. He settled when I told him it was for his own good and that I had done this before and I knew what I was about. That works on him. It worked tonight, she said, and returned to her work. I stood in the middle of the cottage and looked at it. It was a healer's space, well organized, well used, nothing decorative that was not also functional. Dried plants in bundles along one beam. A rack of small jars and folded linen. 2 wooden chairs and the hearth stool. A sleeping shelf behind a curtain. A worktable scarred by years of work. Everything clean. Everything in its place with the quiet authority of someone who had been in this space alone for a long time and had organized it for herself and no one else. On the wall nearest the door, hung on a row of iron pegs, were 6 wolf collars. Not pack collars, no marks, no sigils. Just collars, plain leather, old and cleaned and carefully kept, each with a small piece of folded paper tucked into the band. I looked at them without touching. She saw me looking. When I can, I put down what I remember of them, she said. The coloring, the approximate age, any distinguishing marks. In case someone ever came looking, she paused. No one has come looking, but I kept the records. I looked at the collars. 6. The folded papers, the careful notation, kept for wolves whose packs had never sent anyone to look. How long have you been here? I asked. 7 years, she said. I came up from the fen settlements when the borderland traps started increasing. There were wolves dying in the corridor that no one was recovering. I had the training, and I had no particular reason to be anywhere else. 7 years. In the borderland alone, recovering wolves from territory that my own patrols avoided when possible, keeping records for animals whose people had never come. No pack, no warrant, no payment. Who pays you? I asked. She looked at me again, with that same quality of attention, steady, slightly amused, entirely without guile. No one, she said. Of course. I pulled the nearest wooden chair out from the table and sat down. My wrist was still warm. Hers, I noticed, she had not covered back up. The mate mark glowed faintly gold against her skin in the firelight, a delicate line of it, and she glanced at it occasionally with the expression of someone taking in new information and deciding what to do with it, which was, I would come to understand, exactly what she was doing. You know what it means, I said. I know what it means, she said. Does it? I stopped. I was not a man who struggled for words. I had commanded armies, held councils, delivered verdicts that reshaped pack borders. I had spoken clearly in every room I had ever entered. Does it alarm you? She thought about this with genuine seriousness, her hands still moving through the work in her lap. No, she said at last, I don't think alarm is the right word. She looked down at the mark. I didn't expect it. I don't imagine anyone expects it, but it doesn't feel, she considered. It doesn't feel like something has been done to me. It feels more like something has been confirmed. I did not say anything for a moment. Confirmed, I repeated. I've lived in this corridor for 7 years, she said quietly. The wolves that came through here were hurt and frightened, and I helped them. Some of them were pack wolves, and some of them were wild, and most of them I never identified. But I kept the records because I thought it mattered to have them. I thought someone should know that these animals had been here and had been tended and had gone back into the world. She looked at the collars on the wall. Tonight a different kind of wolf came through the corridor, a bond wolf, and the bond wolf brought a king. She looked at me then, directly, without performance. I don't think that's an accident. It isn't, I said. No, she agreed. I don't believe in accidents. Her name was Marin. She had grown up in the fen settlements 2 days south, trained under a border healer named Asra who had died 8 years past, and then come north because the corridor was needful and she was free. She had no pack name because she had never been pack registered. Her parents had been fen people, holders without affiliation, and she had inherited their unaffiliated status without distress. She cooked for herself and bartered with the occasional patrol that passed, though patrols passed rarely, and otherwise sustained herself by trading dried medicinals to the settlement traders who came through the valley below twice yearly. She had in 7 years recovered and released. She checked a notebook from the shelf, frowning at it in the firelight. 61 wolves. Of those, 11 had required extended care of more than a week. Of those, 4 had remained with her for over a month. All had been released when healed. None had been bond wolves until tonight. She told me this without modesty and without performance, reciting the numbers the way someone recites inventory. This is what the work has been. This is what it has produced, nothing more. She did not tell it as a story of her own virtue. She told it as a record of what had happened, which is how she told everything, and which was more devastating to me than any claim she might have made about herself. I had met women presented to my council as candidates for queen. They had come with their pack's recommendations, their bloodlines, their visible graces and advertised virtues. They had each told me, in various careful ways, what they could offer. None of them had come close. I had told my council this for 3 years, and they had continued presenting candidates, and I had continued declining them. And somewhere in the back of my mind I had concluded, with the quiet finality of a man who does not dramatize his own loneliness, that the mate bond was perhaps not a thing I was going to have. 61 wolves, 7 years, a notebook on a shelf in a borderland cottage kept for animals whose packs had never sent anyone to ask. I sent search parties into this corridor, I said. It came out more roughly than I intended. She looked up. After the first bad campaign season, I said, when the trap reports were highest, I sent patrols through to assess casualties. She nodded slowly. I remember the patrols. They came through the valley below. They didn't come up this far. The heather slope, the rock rise, the cottage set back and unlit except for that single window. My patrols didn't find you, I said. No, she said. I didn't flag them. I wasn't sure of their purpose, whether they were recovering wolves or assessing positions. She paused. I kept working. Of course she had. You could have flagged them, I said. You would have had pack protection, a warrant from my council, payment from the campaign relief fund. Yes, she said without inflection. But you didn't. No. I looked at her. Why? She was quiet for a moment, looking down at the mate mark on her wrist. Care was breathing steadily on the hearthstone, his flank rising and falling in the deep rhythm of a wolf who is well tended and knows it. Because then it would have been different, she said at last. I would have been working for a patrol, for a fund, for a warrant. The work would have been the same, but I would have been doing it for, she stopped, for something external, and that would have changed it even if the wolves couldn't tell the difference. I understood her perfectly. I had not expected to understand her perfectly, and yet there it was. There was a war campaign I had ridden early in my rule, my 2nd year as king, before I had earned the confidence of my generals, where I had made a decision in the field that my council later praised as tactically brilliant, and that I had in fact made because it was the only thing I could live with, the only call that let me look my men in the eye the next morning, and the praise had felt like a translation into a different language, accurate and missing the point simultaneously. The work is the work. Doing it because it is the right thing to do and doing it because someone is watching are not the same thing, even when the outcome is identical. She had known this for 7 years in a stone cottage in the borderland, and had never received credit for knowing it. Marin, I said. She looked at me. My name is Aldrich, I said, because it felt important to say, to offer, the thing I actually was underneath the campaign coat and the king's insignia, just a man sitting in a chair by a fire, my bond wolf breathing on the hearthstone, the mate mark warm and certain on my wrist. And I owe you an apology. For what? She seemed genuinely uncertain. For 7 years, I said. For the corridor. For the patrols that didn't come far enough, and the relief fund that never found you, and the 61 wolves whose records exist only in your notebook because my administration couldn't be bothered to. Aldrich, she said. It was the first time she had used my name, and the quiet authority with which she said it. No title, no deference, just my name. The way you use someone's name when you need them to stop talking and listen silenced me as effectively as anything has ever silenced me. The wolves were tended, she said. That's what mattered, the work got done. It shouldn't have been yours alone to do. No, she agreed, but it was, and I did it, and here we are. Here we are. The mate mark on her wrist, gold in the firelight, care on the hearthstone. The borderland quiet outside for once in 7 years, full and attended and still. There was a knock at the door. Not a tentative knock. Brennan had exactly 1 volume when he knocked, which was the volume of a man who has ridden through the borderland at night following his king's trail and has feelings about this. Marin looked at the door and then at me. Your counsel, she asked. My first marshal, I said, and probably most of the others. I stood. I was surprised to find that I was not annoyed. I had expected to be annoyed, the way I was always somewhat annoyed when my counsel overrode my instructions, which they did when sufficiently alarmed, which was their only consistent flaw and also, if I was honest, their best quality. May I? She gestured at the door. I opened it. Brennan was there, of course, along with Harwick, my campaign surgeon, and 4 of my senior riders, all of them in full campaign kit, all of them wearing the expressions of men who had followed a king into the borderland dark, and were very carefully not expressing their various opinions about this. Brennan's eyes went past me immediately to Marin, then to care on the hearthstone, then to the mate mark on my wrist, which was glowing with sufficient clarity that it was visible in the dark from 3 feet away, and he had enough experience of the old records to know exactly what he was looking at. His expression did not change. He was a good marshal. Sire, he said. The wolf is stable, I said. 2 weeks' rest, then he'll be himself. Come in. They came in, filling the small cottage with campaign kit and the smell of night air and frozen heather. Marin moved to the work table and set down her materials with the composure of a woman who had decided, apparently within the first 30 seconds of the situation, that if a king and his war council had arrived in her cottage, and the mate mark was on her wrist, and care was breathing steadily on her hearthstone, the most useful thing she could do was offer everyone water and not be alarmed about any of it. She offered them water. Brennan took his, looked at the collars on the wall, looked at the notebook on the shelf, looked at Marin, and said, not to me, directly to her, "How many wolves have you recovered from this corridor, madam?" 61, she said. Over 7 years. Brennan looked at me. She has records, I said. Records, Brennan said, in a tone that contained, without expressing, an entire campaign season's worth of observations about the limitations of borderland patrol strategy. In the notebook, Marin said helpfully, and got it from the shelf and handed it to him. Brennan opened it. He looked at it for a long moment. He was a man who had read thousands of field reports and could assess accuracy and care in a record keeper within 30 seconds of opening their work. And what he was reading was clearly holding up under that assessment, because his expression moved from the specifically careful neutrality of a marshal in a complicated situation to something that was, very briefly, uncomplicated. 7 years, he said to the notebook. Yes, Marin said. He handed it back to her. He looked at me. The mate mark, sire. Yes, I said. He looked at Marin again, not with the assessing quality of a man sizing up a political situation, but with the directness of someone who has made a decision about a person and is not going to spend time revising it. Madam, he said, on behalf of the War Council of Draveth, I apologize. Our patrols should have come farther up the slope. Marin looked at him, then at me, then back at him. They're coming in the future, she said simply. That's what matters. Brennan, who had served 3 kings and had never in my memory been surprised by a human being, was briefly surprised. Yes, he said. They are. The War Council stayed until Kerr's breathing had deepened fully into sleep, and Marin had assessed the wound one final time and declared herself satisfied. They stayed with the specific quality of men who have understood that the situation is significant and have elected to be present for it in the way you are present for a thing you know you will want to remember. Harwick examined the splint and the stitching with a campaign surgeon's scrutiny and announced, without apparent embarrassment, that the closure was better than he would have done in the field. Marin thanked him with the directness of a woman who accepts professional compliments as information rather than praise. The younger writers looked at the collars on the wall and said nothing, which was its own kind of respect. I had not yet said aloud the thing that needed saying. I had been raised to understand that the mate bond was destined, not managed, not negotiated, not softened into something more palatable by careful timing or careful words. It arrived and you named it, and the naming was the act of claiming, not the ceremony that came after. The ceremony was for the pack. The naming was between the two of you, the instant of it, the recognition rendered into words before it could calcify back into the uncertainty that the world would otherwise provide in its place. I looked at Marin. She was standing at the work table, cleaning her instruments, and she had been aware of me looking at her for perhaps a full minute in the way that she was aware of most things internally, without exhibition. And when she finally looked up, her eyes were clear and direct and fully present, which I had come to understand in the span of a single evening was simply the quality of her attention. She gave it to everything. She gave it to the wolves on her hearthstone and the records in her notebook and the instruments she cleaned at the end of the night's work, and she was giving it to me now with the same steadiness, and it was the most powerful thing I had ever been given. I would like to bring you in from the corridor, I said, not as a border healer on a warrant. Not as a beneficiary of the relief fund. I looked at my wrist and then at hers, as the woman the bond has named, my mate. She held my gaze. She was thinking, not hesitating, thinking, which were different things. She thought the way she worked, thoroughly, without urgency, without performing the process for any audience. Your counsel is standing behind you, she said. I know. That's where the bearing witness is supposed to happen, she said, not a refusal, an observation. Yes, I said. She looked at my wrist, at hers, at Kerr on the hearthstone, sleeping the deep and healing sleep of a wolf who had, apparently, accomplished everything he set out to accomplish tonight and could now rest. You'll need to reassign the borderland patrols, she said. The trap density in the Northwest Corridor has increased since last autumn, and the current recovery strategy isn't reaching it. I'll have Brennan's team revise the coverage, I said. And the relief fund records are incomplete on the Eastern Corridor. There are at least 4 locations with chronic wolf casualties where a stationed healer would reduce losses significantly. I'll put that before the council this week. Good, she said, and she looked at me with that directness that was not challenge and not softness but was simply her, present, clear-eyed, thoroughly herself. Then yes, she said, I'll come in from the corridor. Brennan behind me was silent. My counsel is bearing witness, I said. I know, she said. There was the ghost of something near a smile now. I noticed them. I crossed the cottage and stood before her at the work table. Up close in the firelight, I could see the mate mark on her wrist clearly, gold-traced, certain, the kind of mark the old records described as impossible to dismiss or misread, the kind that arrived once in a bond wolf's lifetime and only for the truest pairing. I had thought for years that I was simply not the kind of man the bond mark found. I had reorganized my understanding of my own future accordingly, with the composure of a man who does not waste time on things he cannot alter. I was, it turned out, simply a man who had been waiting for a woman who took 7 years to come to his attention, because she had been working in a stone cottage in the borderland without flagging any patrols. I put my marked wrist beside hers. The gold in both of them brightened, as it does when the two marks are brought close, a response the old records noted without fully explaining, because there is no explanation needed. Two things that belong together in proximity confirm what they are. Maren, I said, in front of my war council and in sight of my bondwolf, I name you my mate and my Luna, Draveth's. She looked at our wrists, both golden in the firelight. Aldrich, she said, with the same composure she had used every time, the composure that was not performance but simply her steady architecture. I accept. Behind me, I heard Brennan exhale very slowly, the specific exhale of a first marshal who has followed his king into the borderland dark and watched the mate bond light up in a stone healer's cottage and has various feelings about all of it, all of which he is, correctly, keeping to himself. There was no ceremony that night. The ceremony would come, it always comes, the great hall formality of it, the pack assembled, the declaration made before all, but that was for the pack and for the record and for the administrative requirements of a crown. What happened in the cottage was the real thing, which is not always the same as the official thing, and in this case was, without question, the more important one. We sat by the fire, the four of us Maren, Care breathing on the hearthstone, my marshal and my council ranged behind us with their water cups and their campaign composure, and Maren told me about the corridor. All of it. The seasons of it, the patterns she had mapped, the locations where the trap density spiked after border campaigns, and the locations where she had found wolves too far gone to save, and had stayed with them anyway. She described all of this in the same record-keeper's voice she used for everything, without sentiment, and the absence of sentiment was what made it devastating. Brennan had a field notebook in his coat. At some point he took it out and began writing in it without asking permission. Maren noticed and did not stop him. Dawn came gray and cold through the cottage window before any of us marked the time, and by then Brennan had filled half his notebook and Care had shifted on the hearthstone to put his chin on Maren's knee, which he had apparently decided was acceptable. He doesn't do that, I said. He started an hour ago, she said, looking down at him with the tranquil acceptance she applied to most things. I didn't want to discourage him. Care opened one silver eye, assessed my reaction and closed it again. He was a very old wolf, and he had been right about everything his entire life, and he clearly did not see any reason to start second-guessing himself now. The Great Hall ceremony came 3 weeks later, when Care could walk cleanly on the mended foreleg and Maren had closed up the borderland cottage. Not abandoned. She was very clear. The supplies were left for whoever came next. The records were copied into a second notebook that remained on the shelf, and she had flagged the nearest valley settlement with instructions for whom to contact if a wolf came through the corridor, while the new patrol coverage was still being established. She had spent the 3 weeks in the keep organizing this, and simultaneously being introduced to my council with the same unhurried directness she applied to everything. And my council, who had an average of 30 years' experience in assessing people, and were not easily surprised, had uniformly, within 48 hours, rearranged their impressions of what my queen was going to be like, and had not found the rearrangement difficult. The ceremony itself. My pack assembled in the great hall of Draveth Keep, the northern packs first, which was protocol, then the settlement representatives, then the council, then the court. They had heard, because news of the mate mark travels at the speed that news always travels in a king's hall, which is to say immediately and with embellishment. What they had heard, stripped of embellishment, was this. The king's bondwolf had led him to the borderland corridor in the middle of a campaign night, and there was a woman there, and the mate mark had appeared, and she was, the question that had circulated was on the next point, she was unregistered. No pack name, no family sigil, no rank in any ledger, royal or otherwise. This had produced in various quarters various reactions. The northern pack heads had been cautiously diplomatic. One settlement representative had been less cautious and had asked Brennan, at a pre-ceremony briefing, whether the king was certain. Brennan had said, with the particular stillness of a first marshal who has been asked a foolish question by a man who should know better. The mate mark appeared simultaneously on both wrists in full view of the War Council. The Alpha King's bond wolf identified her independently. I was present. Yes, I believe the king is certain. The question was not raised again. I stood at the front of the great hall and watched them come in. Marin walked with my council escort at the precise pace that said she was neither performing composure nor suppressing anything. She was simply there, the way she was always simply there, present and unhurried and entirely herself. She had chosen what she wore without asking for guidance, and what she had chosen was a Fen settlement formal dress in deep green wool with her healer's hands visible, marked, no gloves. She was not trying to look like anything she wasn't. She stood beside me and looked out at the hall with clear eyes. I named her. The words of the formal claiming, old words in the old tongue of Draveth, which Kerr acknowledged from his position beside the hall's great brazier by raising his chin, and then lowering it with the dignity of a very old bond wolf, who has known how this was going to go since approximately the moment he walked out of the Ashfin Wood 30 years ago, and pressed his head against a young king's knee, and decided to wait. The pack bowed. Not because they were required to. The bow is not required at the naming, only at the formal coronation, but because the hall had a quality to it that made the bow the natural response, the specific gravity of a moment that has been coming for a long time and has finally arrived. 61 wolves, 7 years, a notebook on a shelf in a stone cottage in the borderland. The pack bowed because somewhere in the hall, all of them could feel the weight of what had been quietly good in the world, unwitnessed, and they were witnessing it now. And the appropriate response to witnessing something true is to be still. I covered her marked wrist with my hand. She looked up at me. The mate mark under my palm was warm, the specific warmth that I have described to no one because there are no words adequate to it, the warmth of a thing that has always been true becoming visible, which is not heat so much as recognition, which is not recognition so much as arrival. The corridor is covered, she said quietly for me only. Brennan finalized the patrol reassignments this morning. I know, I said, he told me. Good, she said. And her eyes, clear and direct and fully present, were exactly what they had always been. The eyes of a woman who looks at the work in front of her and does it because it needs doing, and who had been doing that for 7 years in the dark, and who was now here, in the light with me, and who found neither of these states particularly more or less remarkable than the other, because what mattered was the work, and the work was continuing. Kerr from the brazier made a low sound of profound satisfaction. He was, as I have said, right about everything. There is a thing they do not tell you about the mate bond, in the records or the old stories or the chamberlain's careful briefings. They tell you about the mark and the recognition and the claiming. They tell you about the ceremony and the pack bowing and the warmth of the mark under your hand. What they do not tell you is what comes after, the long, ordinary days of it, which are not ordinary at all but feel that way because they are sustained and certain and unhurried, the way all genuinely good things feel once you stop waiting for them to arrive. Marin organized the Borderland Healer Network. It took her 14 months, 3 field assessments, 2 formal proposals to the council, and 1 occasion where she told Brennan to his face that his proposed coverage map was leaving the northeast approach unsecured, which Brennan accepted without argument because she was correct, which he then reported to me with an expression I had never seen on him before and eventually identified as appreciation. She established 6 station healer posts in the corridor territory. She trained the healers herself. She kept the notebook from the cottage on the shelf in our chamber, and she started a new one, and the new one filled faster because more was being recorded now that more people were paying attention. Kerr recovered fully. His silver coat was growing back over the scar on his foreleg in a slightly different texture, paler, which he wore with the indifference of a very old wolf to whom scarring is simply information. He remained, with Marin, in a relationship of total and uncomplicated confidence, which I had previously understood to be exclusive to his bond with me, and had revised my understanding without difficulty. She told me once, on an evening when we were both at the work table, her with the new notebook, me with campaign maps, that she had never thought of herself as someone who had been waiting for anything. "You just worked," I said. "I just worked," she said. "And the bond found you." "The bond found you a bond wolf who knew exactly what he was doing," she said. And looked at Care, who was, as usual, on the hearthstone, which he had established as his position within 48 hours of arriving in Draveth Keep, and which no one had contested. I think the credit belongs there. Care opened one eye. He had, I am quite certain, been awake and following the conversation the entire time. He simply chose to confirm his involvement at the most useful moment, because he was the most competent person in any room he entered, and he knew it and conducted himself accordingly. I looked at my mate, at Marin, her worn healer's hands and her clear eyes and the mate-mark gold on her wrist in the firelight, and I thought of her in the borderland cottage, 7 years alone with a window lit, and a record book, and 61 wolves she pulled back from the cold, asking nothing, keeping the record because it mattered to keep the record, because someone should know that these animals had been here and had been tended and had gone back into the world. Someone knows, I thought, now everyone knows. And the mark on my wrist was warm, the way it was always warm, the way it would be warm every morning for the rest of my life when I reached across and covered her hand with mine at the work table, and she looked up from the notebook with those clear and fully present eyes, and the work continued.